Hello everyone, welcome to our course, which is going to be about the Noteboom system. The first video, I'm going to talk about the anti-triangle variations. So, what you need to know is in anti-triangle variations, white is basically trying to avoid the main lines by defending the c4 pawn later on in the game, and just trying to get a decent position with stable pawn structure and comfortable play. So let's see how to respond to that. The first move is d4, we play d5, white plays pawn to c4, and now black responds with e6. So the first thing I want to mention is that of course we could start like c6, and the difference between e6 and c6, the move order, is basically that after c6 white is able to go to exchange swap, which we are trying to avoid. So e6 gets played, knight to f3, pawn c6. So in this position we have achieved our triangle setup, and basically our next move is going to be d takes c4, and followed by b5, bishop b7, and then c5. So ideally, if that happens, essentially black is just going to get an advantage and go on and win the game. So white should somehow avoid that. Queen to c2 is going to be mainline. Of course, I would like you to as well see other lines like queen to b3 and knight bd2. So I would like to start with queen to b3. So with this move, white is trying to protect the c4 pawn and at the same time create pressure on the b7 pawn. Yeah, so here I recommend to play knight to f6, and white has three options, three main ways to continue here. So the main line is going to be g3, just to finish it to the bishop, castle, and create some pressure along the diagonal h1, a8. Another move is going to be bishop to g5 to pin the black knight, and the last move is going to be knight to c3. Right, so we are going to start with the knight to c3. Here I recommend to take on c4, forcing the white queen to recapture, and then of course we play b5. So here the pawn attacks the queen, and white basically has two options to retrieve the queen. The first one is to d3 to the center, and the other one is to b3. So if queen goes to b3, here I recommend you to protect the b5 pawn more and start preparing the move c5. So we play a6 for that reason. Bishop to g5. So at the first glance it seems that white pins the black knight, and it's not that clear how to proceed here, but you don't have to worry about anything. You can just play knight bd7, and slowly and surely black is preparing c5. So here white has two options. It's gonna be either e4 or e3. So let's start with the move e3. If white plays e3, black doesn't really have any problems at all. Yes, because you can just comfortably play c5, finish the development, and black just has no issues at all. So c5, bishop e2, bishop to b7, and that's just an ideal setup for black. I think black would like to continue with the moves like bishop e7 or bishop d6. I think I would prefer more bishop e7, castling short side. Of course, you can play h6 as well, like a prophylactic move. So in case something happens along the 8th rank, king can always escape. Then white will probably take on c5, just to somehow open up the center a little bit more, and just we can just go ahead and take it with the knight, control the e4 square better. Queen can go to b6. We would love to bring the rooks to the center as well, like rook c8 and rook fd8. Okay, so yeah, here black is just doing fine. Let's go back and continue with the move e4. So, it looks like the next move is e5, and it's quite a big threat. It looks like quite a big threat, but no, there is nothing to worry about, and we can have a great position after c5, which is very strong. The idea is that we are creating the pressure on the d4 pawn, and at the same time, there might be ideas related to attacking the queen with c4 as well. So after c5, the most obvious response is to play d5. And in the game Korchnoi Novikov played in Pamplona, Novikov played c4, and they went on to a draw after queen c2, bishop e7, rook d1, and queen to c7. So here, basically, black is doing completely fine. I would even say that black is doing slightly better. However, the game was finished in a draw. The plan could be just to finish the development to castle short side. The pawn on c4 creates us a great outpost, potential outpost for the knight on d3, and this pawn just gives us much more space on the queen side, which can be used to develop optimally our pieces, like the light squared bishop on b7, connect the rooks, etc. Okay, let's move back a few moves. So here, if white doesn't play d5, but let's say they do like bishop e2, yeah? So here, basically we can just take on d4, play knight c5, or just develop our light square bishop first of all, and then take on d4. That's why the optimal solution for white would be to play d5 immediately after the c5 move gets played. Okay, let's move back. So another option for white is to retreat the queen to d3, a bit closer to the center, looks more safe. So queen to d3. Okay. So here, again, of course, our plan is just to somehow protect our b5 pawn, either with a6, c5, or another plan might be just to play b4 with a tempo. Mostly we play b4 when there is pressure with white's a-file pawn. For example, sometimes after a6, a4 gets played, and it's quite complicated to play c5 if your pawn on b5 is just hanging all the time. So you just have to play b4 first of all, attack the knight, and then black is capable of playing c5 and opening up the game. So after queen d3, my recommendation is to play bishop b7 immediately. So white has 4 options. It can be e4, a3, bishop g5, and g3. So I would like to start with the move g3. So white is trying to finish it on the light squared bishop and castle short side. And here, of course, you'll think that just a6, c5, everything is fine. But the reason, it looks like everything is fine. But if you wouldn't be able to play c5 in time, after bishop g2, knight e5, the spin along the diagonal is very, very unpleasant. So there is quite a strong response by black after g3, c5. So this is a pawn sacrifice. As you see, the pawn on b5 is hanging, which can be taken either with the knight or with the queen. Or, white could try also just to develop the bishop on g2 and continue the game. So let's start, of course, with knight b5. So knight just takes the pawn, but this move is not really good because the pawn on d4 falls. So black plays a6, knight a3. Just to avoid cd as a tempo, we could just take the d4 pawn out, bishop to g2, and there's quite a strong move e5, threatening e4. White cannot take knight e5 because the bishop on g2 is hanging. Yep, so let's see now what is going to happen after bishop to g2. So, white is just trying to avoid complications, develop the pieces. So we just play b4. Now white has two options. It's either knight b1 or knight a4. If knight a4 gets played, there is a move bishop e4, attacking the queen, queen to b3, and c takes d4. White is not really able to recapture this pawn quickly, because the next move is going to be knight to c6. Knight on a4 is quite restricted. The queen on b3 is also not doing much, and black pieces are developed much better. If knight goes to b1, we could just develop the knight on d7 to keep our light squared bishop open. Short castle, rook c8, finishing the queenside development. Knight b to d2, a5. By playing a5, we overprotect our b4 pawn, and we basically expand on the queenside, getting more space there and reminding our opponent that we're going to push him even more on the queenside. So white plays b3 with the idea to fianchetto the dark squared bishop and get rooks into the game. Bishop to e7, bishop b2, short castle, rook ac1. And, in such positions, normally you just play queen b6, rook fd8, h6 and stuff. But there is quite a strong move a4. The idea is that if this pawn gets taken, we can easily get it back by playing knight to b6 with a tempo, yeah. And, if a5, knight a4. So black has an initiative here, because pawn on a2 is an island that's quite a weak pawn potentially in the endgame. The pawn on a5 is going to be recaptured. Then rook fd8, yeah, and black is doing completely fine. So let's go back. So this is related basically to the fianchetto line in queen d3. So we didn't look at e4, a3, and bishop g5 yet. So let's take a look at a3. So by playing a3, white is trying to avoid b4 push, and at the same time there might be ideas to play b4, preventing black from playing c5. So after a3, we play a6, saying for white, go on, play b4. But the reason b4 is not good is that after b4, we immediately play a5, pointing out that our rook on a8 is ready to, to enter the game and to fight along the a file. And the position here is not good for white at all, because pawn on b4 becomes very weak. So after a6, the most logical response is e4. Of course, c5. Yeah, the pawn on c5 is well protected by playing c5. Our light squared bishop is getting active. So e5. If white would play dc, just bishop c5, queen d8, king d8, and this endgame is perfect for black. The bishops are quite active, and the pawn structure is pretty solid. So after c5, let's go on and play e5. So our knight on f6 is hanging. However, it's quite important here to make an intermediate move like c4. So the reason we made this move is to make the d5 square a great outpost for our knight. Queen to c2, knight d5. So currently pawn on d4 doesn't look that weak. However, in the near future, when we get rid of the f3 knight, for example, or our pawn on c4 as well could help us to reach our favorable position by making d3 or b3 squares outputs. Let's say there might be a plan like knight to c6, knight to f5, knight to a5, and then knight to b3. So bishop to e2, knight to c6, castle, and yeah, actually you can just go knight f5 right away, and black has a very comfortable position here. So let's move back a little bit. It's quite understandable what to do after a3, so let's go on and take a look at what is going to happen after bishop to g5. So bishop g5 gets played, knight bd7. So here white has three options: e4, e3, or a3. So if a3 gets played again, white is trying to maybe prevent b4 from happening, and potentially pointing out that b4 is gonna get played by white. So we play a6, preparing c5 as usual, e4, c5, d5, and again we have a nice tempo here. c4, the idea is to liberate c5 square for either our dark square bishop or the knight, and as well by playing c4, this move restricts white light squared bishop. Queen to c2, queen to c7. So there is another idea black could use, is they can play bishop e7, and there is a hidden threat actually which white might not realize at the time. For example, if rook d1 gets played, there is a very strong response, knight d5, and it's very common tactical pattern. The idea is that by sacrificing our knight, we open up the dark squared bishop, and the bishop on g5 is hanging. Yeah, and if bishop e7 gets played, then we can basically recapture with the knight, and everything is fine. Black is up a pawn. Queen c7 can be played as well. For example, it was played by famous grandmaster Alexander Grishuk against Korchnoi in 2007. DE, FE, and black is doing much better here because of the pawn structure and just overall how the pieces are placed. However, Grishuk wasn't able to convert the advantage against Korchnoi in the game. So let's go back. So after knight b7, white has other moves as well. So let's take a look what is going to happen after e3. So after e3, black gets very comfortable position after playing a6, c5. Yeah, so just play a6, bishop to e2, c5, short castle, bishop e7, d takes c5, knight takes c5. We are not afraid of getting the queens off the board. Queen d8, rook takes d8, rook ac1, black can comfortably castle, just putting the king in safety, knight d4, rook c8. That was the game against Anderson and Beliavsky, and just black has much easier play. Bishop on b7 is active. Next move is going to be probably rook fd8, h6, and black will put the king closer to the center by playing king f8, king e8, let's say. Yeah, pawn on b5 nicely restricts white pieces as well. Okay, so this is, considered this is about e3. So let's move to e4. By playing e4, white is, white kinds of threatening e5. However, even if you've missed something like that, there is always h6. But there is much stronger idea black has is b4, of course. So white doesn't really have much of a choice. They have to play knight a4. Knight b1 doesn't really make much sense because, it's basically means that, white is wasting time moving the knight around. So knight a4, queen to a5. So the knight is threatened on a4, and potentially there might be even a threat of playing b3, discover check. So that's why white is playing b3, and I think you saw that coming. c5 is going to be played by black, and the pawn on e4 is hanging, and black basically completed the main plan. White has two options, either take on f6 or d5. If knight on f6 gets captured, we are just going to capture with the pawn. White has two options, either bishop e2 or d5. d5 is not going to be that good for white. It's an inaccuracy because black has a great move, long castle. So, at the first sight, it looks like the king on c8 is gonna be attacked, and there is so much pressure going on and around the queen side. But essentially, white's king is much more in danger, actually. Yeah. So, for example, after bishop e2, we have a very strong response f5. The idea is to weaken d5 pawn. E takes f5, knight b6. So the idea of playing knight b6 is to open up the d8 rook and take the d5 pawn back. Knight b6, queen b6, castle, and yeah, you can just comfortably take two pawns in a row, and black is basically a pawn up. Yeah, black has a powerful attack on the king side, and white doesn't really have enough compensation for the pawn. And actually, this was a game between Korchnoi and Ivanchuk. They played in Lvov, bishop g7. And, black has a pair of bishops and a very comfortable position. So let's go back. Let's take a look what is going to happen after d5. So if white plays d5 here, that's what Grandmaster Bu did. Black is going to castle, to play ed first, excuse me. Ed, bishop d6. So we're not going to rush with taking the d5 pawn. It's quite important to finish the development first, to not get our king in danger, and to complete the development. Queen to e2. So we don't really have much of a choice. We have to put the king to f8. But the threat is that our rook is coming to e8 next move, pinning the queen to the king. So queen to c2 and rook e8, and black has quite a strong attack here. So let's move back. So you kind of get the idea of what is going to happen after bishop g5. Now let's move to the main line, which is e4. So after e4, our idea would be to play b4, knight a4, queen a5, again threatening the knight, and we are slowly preparing the move c5, pawn to b3, c5. So here white has three options. There is an option of Trading off the queen right away by playing queen to b5. White could play as well either e5 or knight e5. So if queen b5 gets played, we could just trade off the queens, bishop to b5, bishop c6, takes, dc knight e4, and pawn on c5 is just weak, and there is no issues for black at all. If e5 gets played, attacking the knight, we have quite a nice intermediate move, bishop a6. Actually, it was played by Kramnik against Wesley Saw in Title Tuesday a few years back. Queen to c2, bishop f1, rook f1. White is not able to castle anymore. Knight d5, dc. It looks like black is down a pawn, and black is down a pawn. However, by playing knight a6 or knight d7 followed by rook c8, black can easily get this pawn back. Knight d7, bishop e3, rook c8, long castle, bishop c5, and Kramnik won the game because white king is just exposed and quite vulnerable. So let's go back. If knight e5 gets played here, then there is quite a strong move, c takes d4. You could also try knight b7, which was played by Wesley Saw against Denis Lazavic in Rapid on chess.com. Knight bd7, queen b5, queen c7. You can avoid the queen straight, bishop f4, and a6. With quite an unclear position. So my recommendation is to play c takes d4, which is stronger. Queen b5, exchange the queens, and we play knight f to d7 with the idea to prepare f6. Bishop to b2, pawn f6, knight e7, knight e7, bishop d4, bishop e4, castle. So black is currently pawn up, but there might be some issues with the development at first, but just in case something is going to be wrong, we are always ready to give this pawn back and finish the development. To get a nice play, bishop d6, rook f e1, bishop d5, and black is doing all right. So let's go back. So this is all about the e4 line and knight c3. Yeah. So let's go to bishop g5 now. So if bishop g5 gets played, black responds with knight bd7, knight c3, h6. So the bishop can either be retreated on h4 or f4. So let's start with h4. If bishop h4 gets played, we can take out the c4 pawn, queen to c4, and there's quite an interesting move, a6. So at the first glance, it looks quite weird because, how does a6 help with b5 if pawn on c6 is hanging? But in the long term, when we play b5, it's much easier to play c5. Yeah, so white plays e3, and we play c5. Yeah, so we just changed the move order. Queen a4, and obviously b5 cannot be played because this pawn is pinned on a6. So after b5, white would just capture this pawn with the bishop. So black plays rook b8, and b5, bishop b7 is going to happen, and black has quite a comfortable position here. So now let's come to f4, bishop f4 move. Here we're going to play a5, which is quite an interesting move. It was played in the game Indich Shevchenko in 2022. the idea is that black is preparing a4. So black is expanding on the queen side. And, it looks like black is just sacrificing the pawn, and for what? But knight a4 actually is going to be a mistake. Because if knight a4 gets played, there is a nice move dc, followed by b5, winning a piece. So after a4, white has to play queen to c2, and black can play a3, expanding even more on the queen side and liberating some dark squares. So if b3 gets played, for example, then just bishop b4, pinning the knight. And the last move related to queen b3 is going to be pawn to g3. So here white is basically white wants to fianchetto the light square bishop, castle short side, just develop the queenside knight and somehow hold the pressure around the center. It's quite similar to Catalan positions as well. So here we're going to take on c4, queen c4, and b5, and essentially it just transposes to the line where white plays queen c2 right away instead of queen b3. So we're going to analyze that just in a few seconds later. So after c6 there is two other options besides queen b3, knight bd2 and queen c2. So now let's start with knight bd2. So if knight bd2 gets played, the idea is that mostly white is trying to prepare e4, either by playing e3, bishop d3 and then e4, or another idea might be, for example, to play just g3, bishop g2 and short castle. So here we are going to play knight f6. White has three options, either g3, e3, or queen to c2. So let's start with queen to c2. Here we are going to respond with bishop e7, pawn to g3, short castle, bishop g2. And our plan would be just to play b6 with the idea to fianchetto light square bishop, and then play c5, so castle, and here I recommend to play c5 right away. So we can either get the position with hanging pawns, which would help us to hold pressure around the center and basically have more space to play with. So if e3 gets played, then we are going to respond with bishop e7, bishop to d3, short castle, knight bd7, and here black is just expecting white to play the move e4, and after e4 gets played, actually the game transposes to the Rubinstein version of French defense. White could also try to fianchetto the dark squared bishop by playing b3, bishop b2, but black has no issues. Black can easily repeat after white by playing b6, bishop b7, and then wait for white to play e4 or play c5 themselves. So knight bd7, e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, and obviously black has to fight for the center. So you can either try to trade up the knights right away, play knight f6, attack the bishop, bishop c2, and then play c5, or play c5 right away, which is my recommendation here. Knight c5, knight c5, dc, bishop c5. So this pawn structure is quite interesting. White has majority of the pawns on the queen side. Black has more pawns on the king side. Mostly the endgames are actually in black's favor in such positions. So white is trying to create an attack while having the queens on the board. So the most logical move here is, of course, bishop g5, pinning the f6 knight, h6. Just very logical and prophylactic move. Of course, the idea is to, just like a prophylactic move, and we want the white bishop to decide whether it wants to stand the diagonal or move away. So bishop h4, and bishop d7 wouldn't be the most accurate move because knight e5 is going to be very strong. So black plays b6, supporting the bishop on c5, and obviously liberating b7 for the bishop. Queen to e2, potentially creating a battery with the queen and bishop, just targeting h7 square. Of course, bishop b7 gets played, rook a d1, threatening the discovered threat, bishop h7, queen to c7. So, it looks like by capturing the knight on f6, white is going to achieve their dream position. Black is just having a horrible pawn structure, but it's not really true. The pawn structure after the trade on f6 is not really that bad for black. White doesn't really have any good attacking opportunities on the king side, and the center is quite open, so black can comfortably get the rooks involved and fight for the center with the pair of bishops. So if bishop f6, gf, bishop e4 can be played with the idea to get rid of the b7 bishop. Then we just play rook f d8 and everything is fine. White could try, for example, to play knight h4, which might look reasonable for the first sight, just to prepare queen g4 or queen h5 next. But we could just play queen f4, for example, hitting the knight on h4. Everything is protected, and black is doing completely fine. So let's go back. So the next move we are going to analyze is pawn to g3. So this move reminds me of Catalan positions a lot, and here I suggest you two main options. You can choose which one fits you better. So the main one, my recommendation is going to be probably bishop to e7. You can also play c5. If you want to take the game into Tarrasch defense, cd, ed, so black should be ready to play with an isolated pawn. Bishop to g2, knight c6, short castle, h6, rook e1, c takes d4, knight to b3, bishop d6, knight bd4. We could just play short castle to finish the development, get the kingside rook involved into the game by playing rook e8. Normally, the plans for black are to control the center, to play bishop g4, rook c8, and try to not trade the pieces too much, because they play with an isolated pawn. So b3, rook e8, bishop to b2, and black can play either bishop b4. It was played, for example, in the game Diak against Carlsen in Title Tuesday Blitz a few years back. You could also play knight e4, and black is completely fine after that. After bishop b4, white had to return the rook. Knight d4, queen d4, bishop a5. Magnus wanted to transfer the bishop to b6 and somehow start targeting f2 square more. So queen d3, protecting the e2 pawn. Bishop b6, rook a d1, pointing out at the d5 weakness, bishop to e6, knight d4, Magnus played bishop d4 here, rook f e1, protecting the pawn. Yeah, because after bishop g4 there was already plans for black to take out the knight on d4 and then take the e2 pawn. Rook c8, h3, bishop h5, g4. Magnus went with the bishop at g6, knight f5, h5, bishop f3, hg, hg, knight e4. So here Magnus made a mistake by playing in knight e4. I mean, which is not that bad, but there was a very nice combination knight g4 here. And the idea is that after bishop g4, you just want to play queen g5, pinning the bishop to the king and winning the piece back and material, of course. And black is going to have a decisive advantage. So let's go back. So this is what's related to the line c5. Now let's talk about bishop e7, which is more solid at some point. Bishop to g2, short castle, and I think it might remind you some of the positions which were analyzed earlier. So black can just play b6, queen to c2, and now c5. So by playing c5, we are saying that we are ready to play with hanging pawns here, which is not a problem. dc, b takes c5, pawn to b3. White wants to develop dark sword bishop on b2, get the rooks into the game. Knight c6, bishop to b2, bishop b7, knight e5, knight b4. Yeah, so we are ready to call the pressure, not to change the pieces so quickly. And it's not that easy to decide for white where to put the queen, because the queenside rook was not developed yet. Normally, when the rook is on c1 or on d1, white can just retreat with the queen to b1 and everything is fine. However, here it's not that easy. So white has to play queen b1, closing up the rook, and a5. a5, it's quite a typical idea when white has this pawn structure, a2, b3, c4. The idea of this move is to weaken b3 pawn. So if cd gets played, just ed, a3, knight c6, takes. So this was a game Mendonca against Maxoglu in 2023, and here there is quite a dynamic play, chances for both sides. White has a weakness on b3. Black hanging pawns might be helpful, but at the same time, if you don't use them properly, they can become a weakness here. So let's go back. So this is what's related to the move knight bd2, and now let's come to the main line in anti-triangle variations, which is queen to c2. So after queen to c2, I'm suggesting you to play knight f6, as always. So there are three options for white. It's going to be either g3, the main line, then there is bishop g5 and bishop f4. So let's start with bishop f4. If white plays bishop f4, my recommendation is just to, just be straight and take on c4. As always, our plan yet to play d takes c4, b5, and then we prepare c5 to activate our pieces on the queen side. So queen c4, b5. By the way, it was a game between Ponomarev and Nakamura, St. Louis Rapid, more than 10 years ago. Queen to c2, bishop b7, pawn to e4, At the first sight it looks like black cannot play c5. Pawn on b5 is always hanging. White has control of the center, but actually black is completely fine. Just after developing the queen side, c5 is going to get played. So knight bd7, knight bd2, a6, a4. There's quite a strong move, bishop b4 now, pinning the knight. Bishop to d3, and of course black plays c5. So the idea of playing c5 is obvious, yeah, so we want to activate the bishop, and of course after c5 the c file open is gonna be open, so rook c8 should be considered later on, as well as c4 and c takes d4. So after c5 in the game between Ponomarov and Nakamura, a takes b5 was played. A takes b5, short castle c4, as predicted, bishop to e2, rook c8, and d5. So, I mean, d5 is quite a common plan in such structures. The idea is that after ed, white wants to consider e5 or something similar to get control over some important key squares and get more space in the center. So after d5 we actually don't have to react at all. We can just play queen to b6, basically supporting our e6 pawn, and b5. D takes e6, we are captured with a pawn, and after e5 obviously our knight goes to the center, and black is doing completely fine here, having a big advantage. Yeah, because after a short castle the f file is exposed and white's king is quite in danger. So let's go back. So this is what you need to know about bishop f4 line. Bishop g5, in my opinion, is a bit more kind of an more attacking and ambitious option. So here I recommend you to take on c4, queen recaptures, of course b5, queen to c2, bishop b7. So here white has three options how to proceed the game, either with e3, e4, or knight bd2. So if knight bd2 gets played, black responds with knight bd7, e4, and we play a6. Just as usual, our plan is to play c5, and yeah, actually it transposed to another line you just saw. And I mean the only difference was that the bishop wasn't on g5 but was on f4. If white plays e4, such moves always have to be under consideration because e5 is basically a threat. So we just play knight bd7 here. If e5, just h6, and black is fine. So white plays knight bd2, a6, a4, trying to somehow hold the pressure around the b5 pawn, not allowing black to comfortably play c5. So we play h6 with the tempo, and bishop f6, knight takes f6, bishop d3, bishop b4, pinning the d2 knight, short castle, excuse me. Nope. Let's go back a little bit. So white played e4 here, yeah. Knight bd7, knight bd2, a6, a4, h6, takes, bishop d3, bishop b4, short castle. So here black has a pair of bishops. The plan is still to prepare c5, and after that happens, all the problems are solved. Yeah, so e5, knight d7. Yeah, so it might be quite tempting to play knight d5, but knight on d5 Of course, it's going to be helpful, yeah, that your knight is on d5, but the disadvantage is that you wouldn't be able to play c5. Yeah, because after knight d5, white could just play knight b3 or knight e4, and the c5 square is taken. So we play knight d7 here, knight e4, b takes a4, rook a4, and c5. Black has an initiative here, and yeah, black is just doing fine. So let's go back. If white play e3, we could just play knight b7, bishop d3, a6, preparing c5, a4. Another disadvantage of a4 is that b4 square is more exposed, so we have very nice check on b4 with the bishop. No need to play bishop e7, no need to play passively here. Knight to c3, c5, a takes b5, and another interesting idea which you might use in your games is c4. So basically the point is that by sacrificing the c4 pawn, the idea is that after the bishop captures the pawn, we want to take ab and open up the a file. So if bishop c4 here, ab, bishop a2, and rook a5. So our next move might be to play queen e8, and just to attack the bishop, attack the rook, etc. Yeah, so black is doing completely fine here. Later on, our kingside rook could come to c8. If white plays bishop to e2, not taking the pawn, then just ab, castle, takes on c3, queen c3, and knight e4. Yeah, black is fine. So there's another option for white besides bishop d3, knight bd2. Yeah, in this case, same thing you saw before. Yeah, we just prepare c5, a6, a4, rook c8, bishop e2, bishop e7, castle, castle, queen to b3. It actually was a game. There was an interesting game between Ilyushin and Kukelko in Moscow Open 2010. Queen b3, knight b6. Bishop to f6, bishop takes f6, gf, knight e4. So in the game, Ilyushin Kukelko played queen d5, which is inaccuracy, even though Kukelko won the game. But rather he had to play knight e4, and at the first sight it looks like what's the point? White is just going to take on a4, ba, queen b7, and white has a winning position. However, after rook takes a4, we have a great idea of playing queen d5. So after queen d5, basically we are forcing white's queen to capture on d5, ed, and the knight on e4 is hanging. So white should take out the pawn, bishop f6, rook a2. So the position is quite unclear. However, black has a bishop pair, and potentially after playing c5 we could activate them and continue. So let's go back a little bit. So that's actually everything about bishop g5 line. So now let's briefly check out what we should do after the move g3. So after g3 we should take out on c4, queen c4, pawn b5, and white has three main options: queen c2, queen d3, and queen b3. So after queen d3, white is trying to keep the pressure on the b5 pawn. Black is playing bishop b7, bishop g2, knight b7, castle, a6, very strong move, a4, and there is a strong move c5, ab, bishop e4, queen b3, bishop d5, queen c2, ab, rook e8, queen e8, knight c3, bishop c6, dc, bishop c5. So black is doing completely fine here. The pawn structure is good. After short castle, the rook is going to be involved. The bishops are doing perfectly fine on its squares. b4 should be under consideration as well, just to liberate e4 square to put there the knight or the bishop. In the PGN files, you could check a bit more deeper lines. So now let's move back to queen b3. So if queen b3 gets played here, we just respond with bishop b7, bishop g2, a6, a4. It's quite a strong move because, after short castle, we just play c5, dc, knight b7, and black is just fine. It's a very common idea not to rush with capturing on c5. So if a4, then we play c5 anyways. So the idea is that after ab, we're going to play c4. Yeah, so this idea is, very common tactical pattern, commonly used in Catalan. The idea is that after, if white would play queen c4, black could just capture ab, queen b6, bishop c6, and black is winning material. So white has to retreat the queen on d1, a takes b5, and it's just easier to play with the black pieces. Black has b4 pawn, b4 square, excuse me. D4 pawn is not that stable. This diagonal a4 h1 is also in black's control. So let's move back. The main move, of course, is going to be queen to c2, bishop b7, bishop to g2, knight b7, preparing c5, castle, and black is ready to play c5. a4. Sometimes in such positions you're able to choose between taking the pawn on a4, playing b4, or a6. It basically depends on how your pieces are developed and where you have this rook on e8. Here my recommendation is just to play b4, expanding on the queen side a little bit. At the same time, by playing b4, we are restricting the white's knight from being developed to c3 on a3. So bishop g5, white is somehow trying to put the black attention away from the c5 square. But you can just play bishop e7, knight bd2, rook c8, creating x-ray, between the queen and the rook along the c file. Queen d3, quite a logical response. Short castle, rook fc1. Here we can play h6, bishop to f6, bishop takes, e3, and it's quite important to be able to take practical decisions in such positions, because basically you understand that you are doing better here. Black is slightly better, but sometimes you're not able to see the best plans, or you just basically you're asking yourself, like, how do I have to proceed? And one of the common plans here is to make a battery with the queen and bishop along the diagonal a1 h1, and you can play rook c7 for that. Yeah, so the idea is that our next move is going to be queen to a8 and rook fc8. So by playing queen e8, we are creating pressure not only on the knight on f3, but at the same time on the d4 square. Yeah, and here obviously black's position is much more preferable. So this is it for today's lesson. Thank you for watching, and take care. I'll see you later. Bye.